Welcome to the Braid Zone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to do a video on directionality and how to get a braid to move where you want the braid to go. We have here a square part. There's a part in the front, underneath, in the back, and on top here. And if we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair this direction and then braid. If we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair in this direction and then braid. If we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair in this direction and then braid. And if we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair this direction and then braid.
Another thing I want to talk about is scalp lines. So the reason we would pull the hair in a particular direction is to cover a scalp line unless it's the part. So this is a clip from the halo, and in order to create the halo you would do a center part all the way down the middle of the head. But you don't actually want to keep that scalp line showing. You want to cover it. And then an important factor is gather, size, shape, placement, angles. So all of the gathers, all of the sections being braided with in the halo are triangular. So at the top of this is a point, and the bottom is a little 1-inch base. And there are two scalp lines. One on the right of it, which is the part, one on the left of it, which was created when we parted off that section. So in order to cover one of those scalp lines, we pull that gather, that section in a particular direction. So the triangle shape is important. The direction that we're pulling the hair is important. As previously mentioned, if you want to cover a line, a part, or scalp line, you would pull the hair over it and braid. So the hair is pulled over a scalp line, and every time we take a gather, every time we pick up hair, not only is it going to create another scalp line, we also need to think, do we want to cover the scalp line that we're creating? Most of the time you do. So we covered all of our new scalp lines in this halo as we gather, as we braid. We create a scalp line, cover it, create one, cover it. At the top of the head here, this is the perfect opportunity for us to cover the top of the part. We do want to cover the top and the bottom of the part because the halo does not have a part. And so when you're at the top of the halo, the gather that is nearest that part line gets pulled over or draped over the part line. So make sure that you're pulling it, angling it, gathering it in a manner that the end result is going to have it covering your part. So that's where the part was, and the top part has been covered by a flap of hair by the braid, and that is ideal. So you get a great starburst pattern. So the technique that I'm trying to teach here, what I'm trying to point out, what I'm hoping you understand is the direction that you braid is important. The angle that you take your gathers is important. Where you're pulling your braid to, the angle that you're taking your gathers, where you're laying down and setting the braid is going to give you beautiful results that you love, or is going to give you something that you're displeased with. When you see something spectacular like this and you think, I have to create that, and you get it wrong, you need to think about what your hands are doing. You need to think about what you're doing to the head. This is another halo, and there's no center part there. And that's because there's not supposed to be. There's no wild, crazy lines going everywhere which way. All the parts are covered by their gathers. There is a little starburst in the center. This is a heart. there is a top center part at the top of the head. There's not a horizontal line just below the point, because that's not what a heart looks like. So if there's one in your heart, you're doing it wrong. And it is created with a center part from the front to the back of the head. And how do you get a heart to look like a heart without this horizontal line smack in the middle of your braid that shouldn't be there? And it's all about directionality. It's all about gathers, placements, sections, and this very, very first gather, this very, very first section, the placement of it is key. It's so important. The direction you're pulling it is important. Where you're gathering into it is important. So directionality is important. If you're creating a shape and there should not be scalp showing, there's a big line somewhere where there just shouldn't be one, to me that's like having the butt crack show. That's the plumber's crack. And if it needs to be covered, then you need to cover it. And if you're not covering it, you're doing it wrong. So I'm going to ramble during this, trying to help you understand, what am I doing with my hands? How am I getting good results? I'm pulling the braid towards myself, towards my belly button, or in between my boobs, but I'm pulling it to me. And if I'm standing somewhere that I don't want the braid to go, then I move myself. And so when I braid, I constantly move around my clients so that I'm always pulling the braid towards me. Gather sizes are really, really important and can create scalp lines if done wrong. A braid bump is the size of the bump on the side of a braid that is created when you weave the hair. So you can see the dotted lines in the center of this braid, and what it's pointing to is a braid bump. That's one braid bump. And you want your gathers to be that size. You don't want your gathers to be larger than that overly or smaller than that. If the gathers are smaller than that, you're going to get a butt crack. If the gathers are too big, then you're going to create, by default later, you're going to create a butt crack that you don't mean to, because you're not going to have enough hair for the next gather. When your gathers are too big in one place, that doesn't give you enough hair in the next gather. So can you find the braid bump in this little clip? The braid bump is in my left hand, and it's that little bump created by the braid. And can you tell what the size of the gather should be based on that braid bump? The gather should just a slight bigger. So the 2 X's on the left are the braid bump, the 2 X's on the right are the gather size. Notice how the gather size is just a little bit bigger. The angle of the gather is really important. We are braiding a full circle around her head to create a halo. And so yes, the outside gathers are going to be a little bit bigger than the inside gathers because there's a lot more space or ground to cover on the outside. So it's not quite a triangle. And we just pulled the hair into the braid bump. The gather is about the same size as the braid bump, just a sliver bigger. And notice again, gather is about the same size as the braid bump. If it was too big, you would be taking hair that is needed for the next gather, which would create a scalp line, which is like having the plumber's crack show.
So if you take a section of hair and start braiding, if you want this braid to go down towards the ear, then you're going to direct that braid down towards the ear. If all of a sudden you need your braid to make a sharp turn, all you have to do is this gather is this long as the braid goes down. You can shorten this gather by turning the braid up. So pulling the bottom one tighter, making this shorter, cinching that up, and just by curving your hand, you just change the directionality of the braid. And now your lower gathers from underneath are going to come up a lot further. So you've got a lot more distance to span or to cover with the hair from the bottom. So you bring that hair all the way up to the braid. And then the distance that you're spanning from the top is a lot shorter. You bring the hair from the top down to the braid. And you can keep turning this braid in any direction you want. So I'm going to keep bringing it up. The distance from underneath has increased. And we're bringing this all the way up. And then I want to bring this braid back down towards the nape of the neck. So I'm going to bring my hands down, bring a braid, gather from the top into the braid, cinch that up tight, and then bring the gather up from the bottom and keep that cinched up tight. And so you can see that the way you take your gathers, the placement of the gathers, and the way you use your hands while you're braiding will create the directionality that you desire as you're braiding. And you should be able to create any shape on the head using these simple techniques and this simple trick. So notice how the braid goes down, up, down. And it's the way you move your hands and the way you take your gathers.
So back to that heart shape that we were doing earlier. How do you get that perfect heart shape? How do you create a heart that doesn't have lines in places they shouldn't be? It all happens with the sections that you're taking, the gathers that you're taking, the size, the shape, how you're moving your hands, where you're pulling the braid, the direction and angle of each gather, and then the size of those gathers versus the size of the braid bump that they're being placed into. So all of these are important factors, and I hope you keep them in mind while you're braiding.
And if we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair this direction and then braid. If we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair in this direction and then braid.
So it all matters. Gather size, gather placement, the angle of the gather, where your hands are, how they're moving the braid, everything, it all matters. It will either give you a butt crack in your braid or it won't. So keep that in mind. Gather sizes, very, very important. Pay attention to what you're doing. Pay attention to what your hands are doing. Where are you pulling that braid? Is it the correct direction? How big is that gather? Should it be smaller?
If we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair in this direction and then braid. And if we want to cover this part, we're going to pull the hair this direction and then braid.
I totally understand if this feels like a sporadic, erratic, crazy conversation, but all of the pieces that I'm trying to teach are here. Everything that I hope that you're getting is here. Yes, it's spliced from a bunch of different videos, and I'm sorry about that, but I believe if you watch it, practice it, watch it, practice it, watch it, practice it, eventually it's gonna start making sense, and maybe someday I'll have everything that I need to make better videos than this. But in the meantime, this is what I am offering you. It's good advice, and hopefully you can find that advice in all of this crazy randomness. Have fun braiding, and we will see you next time.